We live in a society driven by noise. Think about it. The sound of an alarm clock or birds chirping in the morning lets you know it's time to wake up. The sound of the car engine turning on lets you know that your car is in working order. The coffee machine lets some of us know we are one step closer to being ready to talk to other people in the morning. The sound of traffic lets you know whether or not the commute to work or home will be light or heavy. The sound of the keyboard clicking in the office lets you know your coworkers are busy at work, hopefully. That text message or phone call notification lets you know that somebody's trying to reach you. The sound of kids laughing and playing lets us know that all is well. And the sound of the organ on Sunday mornings lets us know it's time for church to begin. We depend on sound for almost everything in our lives. Without the noise, we don't actually know it's time to wake up, or that the car is working, that traffic is clear, that our coworkers are nearby, that someone is calling our phone, that the children are happy, or that it's time for worship. Noise, or the presence of sound and something that is clearly identifiable, it has become the indicator of all things good and bad and comfortable, including our understanding of God. If we just think about it for a moment, we need to be able to identify God's movement in our lives in order to believe that God is present. We only consider God to be a provider when we can identify our next meal or our next check. We only consider God to be a healer when we can identify that we feel well in our bodies or when our health seems to be at 100%. We only consider God to be a creator when we can identify the presence of something new. And consequently, in the absence of something new, in the absence of good health, in the absence of a meal or even a paycheck, we reason that God must not be creator, healer, provider, or even present. And that's what happens with Elijah in our text. In his moment of discouragement, defeat, and despair, because he couldn't clearly identify support or refuge from his troubles, he reasons that he's alone, that he's ill-equipped to continue, and that he's a failure. But he's not alone, is he? We've all been there before. We've done everything we were supposed to do. We moved when God commanded us to move. We confronted issues and people that we knew we needed to. We checked every box. We crossed every T, and we dotted every I on this journey called life. Yet here some of us are discouraged, defeated, confused, lonely, and weary. In times like these, like Elijah, we've waited for God to provide food and strength for the journey. We've asked that God would even choose another vessel, somebody more equipped or more experienced, anybody but us. And maybe, friends, this isn't your story, but you probably know someone who can relate. And like Elijah, they're wondering what to do amidst life's silent seasons. But let me be the first to say it's not any of our faults. I don't want anybody to blame themselves for feeling the way that they do, because I firmly believe it's our society's obsession with noise and our misunderstanding about sound that has created the problem. The more I think about this, the more I realize that perhaps the solution is found in us expanding our understanding of the presence of sounds and changing how we react to them. Sure, there are indeed times when a sound is loud and clear and easily identifiable. But what do we do when the sound is faint? What do we do in those times when our perceived absence of sound is all we have? You see, according to filmmakers, sound is necessary to motion picture. But sometimes the absence of sound says it all. A moment of silence, they say, regardless of how brief it might be, can completely command our attention and alter the way we engage with a movie. They theorized, however, that the moment of silence is difficult to create. The truth is, the theater is never silent. Between the sounds of people breathing, the rustling of candy wrappers, the sound of crunching popcorn, there's always evidence of some kind of sound. And so in order to create these moments of silence, filmmakers use perceived silence as opposed to literal silence by incorporating little or faint sounds into the movie, heartbeats, ticking clocks, rustling leaves, all to give the audience the impression of a convicting silence. But why? What's the point? Because filmmakers realized early on that silence needs loudness, and loudness needs silence in order to have any kind of impact. These contrasting sounds immerse us in a story. They accentuate the stillness. They move us beyond our comfort zones. They cause us to sympathize and to think more deeply and honestly, and they complete our stories. It has been said, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. When language, which is both logical and representational, can no longer cover thought, linguistic silence takes over. These contrasting sounds, therefore, grant us a more complete picture. So I ask the question again, what do we do when the sound is faint? What do we do in those times when our perceived absence of sound is all we have? Friends, we embrace it. We immerse ourselves fully in the story. We move beyond our comfort zones. We take a moment to think more deeply and honestly. We recognize that the contrasting sounds are necessary in order to get us a clearer picture. We understand that, like we see in the story of Elijah, the contrasting sounds have something to teach us. Friends, when we consider the interactions between God and Elijah in our text for this morning, we see firsthand the work of contrasting sounds at play. I'd like to suggest that within just 8 verses of Scripture, in the presence of various voices and sounds and amidst sorrow and defeat, we are given a deeper glimpse of God and God's concern for each of us. Elijah's experience on Mount Horeb has something to say to each of us here today. Whether you find yourself on the precipice of facing defeat, in the midst of encountering defeat, or even at the crossroad where defeat and victory first meet, the same God who was revealed to Elijah is also present for us. At the very beginning of his story, Elijah makes reference to the ancestors, those who have come before him, other prophets and leaders who have found themselves in a similar predicament. He confesses to the Lord that he is no better than those who have come before him, and he uses this to compel the Lord to remove his mantle from him. As the story unfolds, we find that everything about this story is going to look differently than it has in the past. While God spoke to others with wind, earthquake, and fire, here God does not. Whereas God previously spoke to Elijah with wind, earthquake, and fire, here God does not. Where God has radically transformed the heart and mind of prophets on the mountaintop before, here God does not. But rest assured, friends, God still shows up, and God still speaks. God just chooses to do it differently. And that's not because God is no longer able to do the same things as before, but it's because in this particular moment and at this particular time, the revelation and the answer is different. Different seasons do in fact call for different sounds. You see, before Elijah receives a set of instructions for what to do next, and before God commands Elijah to move on, God does something different. Elijah receives sustenance and strength for his journey. He is then graciously led out of his cave, and he's confronted by a God that speaks directly to him. So often throughout Scripture, we see God speaking through other people or even through other things. So often we experience God as being nearby but not quite close enough. Yet here God recognizes in the Scripture that Elijah needs something different, something additional in order to believe. Instead of only using a mediator, God also speaks. Instead of using a bush or some force of nature, God uses the sound of sheer silence. Instead of the similar and the same, God chooses something different. And as we see it with Elijah, consider that perhaps within your own situation, God isn't actually absent. Perhaps God isn't even silent. Instead, friends, perhaps God is simply releasing a different sound. The kind of sound that says your Mount Horeb won't look like everyone else's, and that's okay. The kind of sound that says, whereas I moved in the wind, earthquake, and fire before, this time I am graciously leading you out of your cave with just a whisper. The kind of sound that says God recognizes when even we need a different sound. When life has thrown loud and destructive stumbling blocks in our way, when the world around us is overwhelmed with loud and destructive policies, practices, and people, when the people in our lives have issued loud and destructive words about our life and our purpose, here, God recognizes that what we need is a different sound. A whisper. The sound of sheer silence. The perceived absence of sound. The sound of something different. Sacred silence. It's the kind of silence amidst contrasting sounds that speaks louder, yet more graciously than anything you've heard before. It's the kind of sound that encourages you to embrace something different, to sit still and to experience God in another way. I get that it's uncomfortable sometimes, but different seasons do in fact call for different sounds. You see, friends, just a few weeks ago, we were gearing up for one of our busiest seasons as a church. We were overwhelmed with deadlines. We spent early mornings and long days working to tie up loose ends. We were juggling between emails, phone calls, and meetings to make sure everyone was in place and ready for what was ahead. And also, just a few weeks ago, we probably doubted that we'd make it to this point. Yes, I know we've done most of this before, but I'm certain that there came a moment in the preparation where we wondered how exactly everything was going to come together. And after one of the noisiest and busiest seasons of church life here at Asbury First, here we are. We've endured a bake sale, storehouse summer sale, chicken barbecue, Park Ave Fest, vacation Bible school, block party on East, and we had 700 plus people show up to play hopscotch, causing us to not only meet but exceed the number needed to break the record. If these past few weeks haven't been evidence of the contrasting sounds of life, I don't know what is. But I do know this. For many, the culmination of that season means gearing up for a new school year, returning to life responsibilities and duties that took a back seat, figuring out what the next project or activity is that needs our planning, and even contemplating over whether or not we did the very best we could. In more ways than one, at the crossroads where our stressful period and victory now meet, things might appear a bit silent. And perhaps that silence and stillness is a little uncomfortable for us, because we truly do not know what to do when the noise stops. But I hope to encourage you with this. I know that the noise was loud and significant and clear, and that this time of stillness might even appear to be useless, pointless, and discomforting, but rest assured, you need this sound too. You see, the thing about contrasting sounds working together to complete us is that you need every single sound in order for it to all work together. And at the culmination of a very busy season for Elijah, God invites Elijah into a moment of silent reflection, a brief season of stillness, where Elijah is invited to reflect and ponder a question from the Lord. Similar to the dramatic effect of perceived silence that filmmakers have used to capture our attention over the years, God does the same here. God asks Elijah, "What are you doing here?" In the verses that follow our reading selection, God asks Elijah the same question again. Now, many have argued that the presence of this question was meant to offer rebuke for Elijah since he did run away, but I don't think that's what matters for us today. Instead, I share the sentiments of other scholars who reason that this question posed to Elijah was intended to grant him a moment of reflection, a moment to reflect on his mission, his purpose, and his assignment. I believe, friends, that the question of "What are you doing here, Elijah?" is intended to cause Elijah to take seriously this moment of perceived silence, this opportunity to sit still, and that in doing so, he might feel, think, and embrace the moment a little differently. And at that point where we find ourselves, I do believe God asks us the same question. Whether directed at our personal lives, professional pursuits, or our plans as a congregation, in moments of sacred silence and divine stillness, God asks the question, "What are you doing here?" We too are invited to reflect on our mission, our purpose, and our assignment. Because despite what the noise of this world might suggest, each of us has a unique purpose that makes us of special use to God and to this world. I know the noise of this world has suggested time and time again that in order to answer that question, you have to search for it out there. But I want to invite you to do what God calls Elijah to do on Mount Horeb. Take a moment just to pause and sit still, to embrace the silence and answer that question. What are you doing here? The truth is, God asks it because God already knows you have significance, regardless of what the noise of this world might suggest. May we be compelled in our movement forward to embrace even this period of perceived silence as a church. Friends, perhaps God is using the contrasting sounds of life around us to command our attention. And if we only listen for God in the loudness, we'll miss what God is doing in those moments of sheer silence. And in just a few moments, you and I are going to experience our call to prayer and our prayer response in silence. As we listen to the contrasting sounds around us, our neighbors breathing, papers shuffling, and whatever else you might hear, may we embrace a few moments of silent reflection surrounding the pastoral prayer, being careful to listen for what this moment of perceived silence might teach us. Amen.